Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for APQC's January 2022 KM webinar, The Steps KM Forgets When Managing Change. And it's a new year. I'm really excited that we're kicking off with a change management topic for the webinar because I feel like better change management is a great New Year's resolution for all of us, especially after 2 years of so much never ending and often unplanned change. I think we as KM people and all of the end users and leaders that we serve are feeling a little bit of change fatigue. So it's a great time to reassess our change approaches and hopefully, have some proactive ideas to make change stronger in your organization, to be nimbler about change, and ready to handle whatever 2022 throws at us. So I wanted to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I am Lauren Trees. I lead the Knowledge Management Research Program at APQC, and I've got one of my colleagues here. Cindy, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for letting me be your co-pilot today. It's always fun, and you're right, the topic is always promising, especially at the beginning of the year. We get to do a lot of strategic thinking about how we're going to make things happen. I lead our client solutions here at APQC, means I get to work with talented people like Lauren and work on our research agenda and conferences, but mostly pay attention to our members and what they're doing and needs are in terms of data, information, and services. Nice to be with you today.
And Cindy and I are both going to talk about these steps that people forget while managing change today. And Cindy is also going to keep an eye on the chat window and the Q&A window. We really want today's session to be interactive. Change management is a topic that lots of you have experience around. Lots of you have great ideas. And so we want to capture those and find out what you're thinking as we go along.
We've got a big global audience, Lauren.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
So APQC does a KM Trends survey every year or two. And as part of that survey, I like to ask about the skill sets that KM leaders feel like they really need to develop for their teams right now. And I'll tell you, as long as I've been doing this survey, change management is almost always first or second on that list. And the percentage was particularly high the last time we did the survey in fall of 2021. And for me, that makes sense. We all need change skills, and we've all been encountering a lot of change in our KM programs. What's even more interesting is everything else that's on this list of the most in-demand skills. Because change management, let's face it, is not just one skill. You need a variety of skill sets for a good change approach. And one of those is design thinking and human-centric design, which you'll see had a huge jump up on this list from when we did the survey in early 2020, right before the pandemic hit in the US, to fall 2021. And, I think change managers don't have to use explicitly a design thinking methodology, but that ability to look at things from the end user perspective and design the change with the end user in mind is critical here. I also think analytics is an important skill set for change, and data management, because if you don't have good, clean data to put into your analytics, it's garbage in, garbage out. We see a lot of organizations go through their change management checklist and do the training, do the rewards, and say they're done. But done right, change is an iterative process, and we're going to keep saying that throughout this session. And you're constantly looking at data, looking at feedback, drawing insights from that, accommodating new information into your KM approach and your change approach. So if you don't have good data and analytics skills, I think you're kind of flying without a compass in that iterative cycle. And then obviously active listening and communication are critical here, and problem solving, again, as you tweak, as you figure out what you need to do next. So in a world dominated by so much change, I think it's interesting to see that all of the in-demand skill sets for KM play into a successful change approach.
Lauren, I have to comment that my disappointment on here, we're seeing the low ratings of interpersonal and problem solving. And so I thought, let me tell a short story. I'm going to try to not make this short story long, but I had to tell you all. So for 25 years, I've had the opportunity to work with our members and clients and deliver KM services along with other things. And it's so easy to tell you all, you got to pay attention to your audience. You've got to have good conversation. But about a year and a half ago, we launched a very formal internal content management effort at APQC. It's a strategic initiative, and I'm honored to be the executive sponsor for it. We have a small team around it. It is a business dictated solution. So now what does that mean? Well, it means that all the way from our CEO, who is our champion and somewhat of a very outspoken client of ours, all the way down to our leadership team, and Lauren Trees, who is actually one of our very early clients that we're working with. But anyways, it came to pass last week that we're moving forward with our charter for this year and what we're going to accomplish. And our CEO had some questions, and she started out the conversation in email. I quickly moved it because I thought, oh my gosh, this could go so off rail with a lot of people copied. Let's get with her and really listen to her. And we did. And she had some concerns about where we were going. She saw some barriers. She wanted to share some stories. We listened intently, took notes, came to a great place in the middle. And at the end of the day, she said, "Thank you for getting with me and for listening to me." And I just wanted to remind you of that little phrase. And then Lauren and I were talking about this. I thought, oh man, it's part of your whole change management repertoire. It's your portfolio. So while they had lower scores, Lauren, in terms of the top skill sets, I think they're two of the most critical things, because your users and your people who are supporting you are going to always help you problem solve if you do it right. So there's my short story, and I'll tell more about it as we go through today.
Absolutely. And these are the top skill sets that they felt like they needed to build. So it's possible that the KM teams feel like they already have really good active listening and communication skills, but I always encourage people to continue to hone those skills. I think they're like anything. If you don't use them and continue to evolve them, they start to atrophy. So I think that's really important to focus on. So obviously change skills are important if you can't listen, if you can't empathize, if you can't communicate, if you can't constantly analyze and adjust to reality on the ground, you're going to wipe out big time. But at the same time, the right skills aren't enough. You have to have a good methodology and process for change. Otherwise, I think you're going to go around in circles and definitely miss important things. So you need both. And I was talking to Cindy about this slide yesterday, and she pointed out that this does not look like a very fun place to be, these stairs. And she actually pointed out that there's mold on the wall in this picture. And so we were kind of talking about how sometimes when you're at the beginning of a change initiative, it feels like you're at the bottom of a pretty ugly set of stairs with mold on the wall. But it is hard sometimes, but it is worth getting to the top there.
No, and guys, here's what I told her. I said, the only thing that I'd change, other than I'd get my spray can, because I'm OCD and that mold just drives me nuts. But look, you actually feel like that, right? When you start a new project, when you're trying to support change, it feels so bad sometimes in the middle of this. And I said, just change it all. Make sure that you've got this beautiful picture at the top, not that door that you don't know where it goes. It may open up to something wonderful, but yeah, it does feel awful sometimes, Lauren, when you get started.
I remember when I first moved to Texas and I went to the DMV to change to a Texas driver's license, and I got to the front of the line and I realized that the line was to get a number to go stand in another line. And I feel like sometimes change feels that way. You think that you're there, and then you realize that you just got your number to go stand in another line. So, it's really about perseverance, a lot of this, and continuing to climb over those obstacles. And hopefully, the steps that we talk about today will give you a few more tools to do that. But we wanted to kick off with a poll just to get an idea for everybody who's on the line today about what are your biggest gaps when it comes to KM change. Is it really around planning the change and making sure you're doing the right things? Is it around communications? And I would include training in that category. Is it around integrating things, the change into workflows and expectations? Is it in that iterative cycle, the troubleshooting and evolving, sustaining the change over time? Or is it around building ownership with your business stakeholders to take some accountability for the change? And you should be able to, just select the one that you feel like is your biggest gap here. Or if it's something else, feel free to put that in the chat, because I know this is not an exhaustive list. And it looks like we have a comment from Colleen in here. One of the biggest challenges with change is that leaders talk about the importance of it, but they don't necessarily want to do the things to actually support the change. Yeah, and leadership support is a big category here. Yeah, for sure. And then we have another comment around, sometimes the challenge is articulating what will be different after the change so leaders feel they can support it. I definitely put that in the communication category, but there are a lot of different things going on here. So this is interesting, a lot of focus on integrating the change into workflows and expectations and building KM ownership for sustained change. Yeah. And that's about 2/3 of you in those two categories. And that makes sense to me.
It does. Lauren, I think the leadership comment is important. Someone says leadership support depends on perceived alignment with existing strategy. I agree. And that's where I think those conversations become so important. And that's hard you can build a change management plan, but unless we're going to talk about iterative activities, if you don't have iterative conversations built in, it's hard to stay in alignment with leaders. Things change a lot in your organizations.
Well, and I think particularly with KM, there is a very fuzzy line between designing the KM tools and approaches and designing the change approach. And they're really interlocked, and sometimes improving the change approach involves improving what you're doing and its alignment with the business, because that's what takes fire and gets you that adoption. Yeah. So here are our 8 overlooked steps for KM change management that we want to talk about today. And we've laid them out according to a pretty simple 5-phase model for sustained change. You want to plan the change, you want to communicate the change, so building that awareness with leaders and end users, building desire, building knowledge, all that front part of the ADKAR model. And then we really wanted to emphasize reinforcing the change. So keeping it top of mind and that building it into the way people work, that I think was the top gap that everybody on the call said they were having. Improving, so that iteration cycle where you keep evolving what you're offering, recommunicating what's new and better, because every time you improve, you have to do some of that communication back into that cycle, and gathering feedback so you can improve some more. And then finally, building ownership where the business groups you're supporting start to feel like they have skin in the game for managing their own knowledge in this new and better way. So we're going to talk about each of these 8 steps and share some examples, but I want you to keep this model in the back of your mind as an organizing framework. And I also want you to give us some feedback on this model now, later, whatever format. What are we missing? Where do we maybe need a shift in emphasis? Because we're piloting this all with you today, and I really want to refine it and make it better so that it really reflects the change experience that KM has. And
Lauren, we've already had a great comment. Thank you, Sylvia, saying sometimes building ownership has to start at the beginning. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's a piece that goes all the way through. What you're looking here in the model is sort of the culmination of, do you have it? And now how do you keep it?
Yeah, no, I think if you're not planning effectively for the change, then you're never going to get to that building ownership. So all of these pieces are intertwined at various stages for sure. So the first step is that we find people forget is that they don't go deep enough when they're designing the change. People plan, but a lot of the planning is around logistics. When are things going to roll out? When are we going to send an email? When are we going to do training? And how are we going to deliver that? And I think some KM teams don't spend enough time asking the hard questions. Are we changing the right things at the right time in the right way? And some aspects of change may get dictated to KM. We are moving to Office 365 and you will move all of your KM, systems into that, whatever it is. But you can always do more to understand the end user and their needs and then scope the problem from that end user perspective and brainstorm solutions also from that end user perspective. I mean, in KM, so many of the changes that we're working on are behavior changes. So as I said, a lot of the solutions I think are built into the KM tools and approaches themselves. How do I make it easier to do this than not to do it? And part of this, I think, is not over designing and falling in love with your own ideas. You've got to develop something, try it out with maybe a subset of users, see if it drives the behavior that you're hoping for, and be ready to readjust. And last November, Robin Ray Howitt did a webinar for us on what he calls KM model innovation at Microsoft. And I loved his approach so much. I had to put this in here. If you're interested, I encourage you to go back and watch that webinar again. Microsoft had an initiative to increase grassroots innovation in the 98% of their workforce that's not in developing products and services. And they had this initiative in place, but they weren't really getting the results that they wanted. So they called in the cavalry, they called in KM to help them improve and redesign it. And the KM team used this, what I would call a strategic planning approach, to redesign the innovation project. And it really starts with defining personas around key stakeholders. So for this project, they defined 4 personas. So that was the innovators, the employees who wanted to develop and submit new ideas. The contributors, so those are folks who don't have ideas, but they have expertise and desire to contribute and help others refine their ideas. Management, who is responsible for vetting and prioritizing the ideas. And then finally, consumers, who are going to take those ideas and use them in their work for Microsoft. And with those 4 personas at a starting point, the team was able to figure out what KM services they needed to provide, how those services should be delivered, what partners and relationships they needed to get to the value around adoption and change management, rewards and recognition, and also just increasing the number of innovations that are moving through that pipeline and how much those innovations are getting reused. And I think that the key to success here was looking at all 4 personas that were involved in this process, not just the innovators with the ideas, and really understanding the interplay between those stakeholder groups. And that led them to understand the ecosystem to get everyone aligned so that they could embed this in people's work processes and the culture, and ultimately build that business ownership. So I think you see that cycle right through here. So the next step in our model is around communications. And we have some great resources on communications around branding, messages, distribution. What I really want to focus on here is what I think KM teams most often get wrong in terms of communications, especially around rollouts and other big changes. I think communications tend to be too generic, and sometimes they focus too much on how KM is going to help the organization versus the individual. People care about organizational success, but what they really want to hear is, how is KM going to help me? Susan, the mechanical engineer with 7 different projects and clients breathing down her neck for revisions, whatever it is. So you really have to customize the messaging as much as possible and give specific examples of how KM can help. And when you're just starting, that might be hypotheticals, but as you build success stories and data, you can start to weave those in. I think people really respond best to communications that feel tailored to them and that focus on their needs and their use cases. So I know there's somebody out there who is, saying that's a lot of work. And it is. And sometimes it's frustrating if you'd really rather be out there building things. But if you're building things and no one's coming, you realize that you have to devote energy to, communicating the change and really making it real for people in context.
Mm-hmm. Lauren, we've got a great set of comments and questions going on about this topic. And I love one of the questions that somebody said, yeah, I can relate to this. How do you keep, as a KMer, motivated and sane as people are, as things are not happening with KM? And I think a lot of it, Allie, centers back into this communicate. And I want to reinforce something that Lauren said. I think a lot of times we create our communications and they're big and broad. And my comment was, just stay close to your users right now, your advocates, your people who are using it. And that's where, when we say communicate, you do have to have good messages, but you also have to have conversations. And to me, that's shifting when things are not going on. You just have to have a lot of voice of your customers going on and finding out what's going on or not.
If you can find somebody with a problem and figure out even some little thing that you can do around knowledge that might help them, I think sometimes you got to start small and just have some incremental milestones for yourself to keep from going insane.
Yeah.
I think there's also a really good question here around how long should change management engage with stakeholders after the change has taken place. And I think that this really goes back to the iterative cycle. I think you have to keep communicating, and we have some good communications templates. And, I think that there's some front end communication that really happens before and during change, but it's an ongoing process. And it may not be an official change management process, but there's communication that needs to go on an ongoing basis.
Yes.
And we have lots of examples of good messaging. This one I picked from Deloitte because I think there's a couple of interesting things going on really around understanding the user and their context. So Deloitte, professional services organization full of consultants. Consultants care about a couple of things. One is having successful projects, and one is building their reputation and prestige inside the organization for their career development so they can get staffed on new projects. And so I think the examples here really focus on that. Learn how to amplify your impact. And then over on the right-hand side, you have a success story around how Deloitte Canada used, their quals database, which is part of their KM program, to win a new kind of work that they had not won before. So it shows people, okay, well, if I use these tools, if I use the knowledge that's available to me, maybe I can help win new work, deliver work more effectively. They have all these different success stories. They're each one slide, so they're really consumable. And then on the left-hand side, you have an example of their KX leaderboards for people who have, reached the top of the pile in terms of contributing and reusing knowledge. And they get a badge on their, expertise profile within the intranet site and things like that. So I think this really speaks to things that their audience cares about. I mean, we've done so many different case studies with different organizations. We did one with a company that makes safety ladders, and all of their messaging was focused on, well, if you reuse knowledge, that will help you save lives, because that was what's really important in their organizational culture. We did one with a big pharmaceutical manufacturer that was focused on stories of, I got to go home an hour earlier and play with my kids because I used this. So I think that you've got to kind of clue into what's going to be important to each audience, and it may be different in different parts of the organization, and really customize those messages.
Yeah. And Lauren, remember, we've done that, guys. Don't forget, you've been doing that for 2 years with this global pandemic that we've all been going through together. It's a common thread of all of us. And we've seen some people really turn on a dime and get very targeted in communications on what the user needs to hear. So consider that. I think you have some really good things going on, but we just forget. We go back to where we were before.
And some great comments in the chat around using video. I think that that's really powerful as well, especially if people are working virtually and having communications in different modalities. Some people like to read things, some people like to watch things. That's all really crucial to kind of meet different learning styles and different communication styles. So as you think about these customized communications, I think one key is really to have those on the ground advocates who can customize the KM message and deliver it in team meetings, at local events, small group trainings, and conversations. That really is your last mile of KM communications and something that you can do on an ongoing basis long after the official change approach maybe has ended. And these advocates take many forms. Sometimes they're full-time KM roles, part-time KM roles. More often they're volunteers or just super users with some enthusiasm that you can harness. And we've listed, they're called all sorts of different things. KM champions, KM advocates. Sometimes they're your community leaders or facilitators. And they do all sorts of different things, from helping you identify critical knowledge out in the business, opportunities to apply KM. Hey, this team has a problem and I think we could really leverage a KM solution here. They provide a lot of that one-on-one hand-holding coaching support for people, especially maybe who are on the latter half of the adoption curve. They can guide KM approaches and events. And they also serve as a great feedback mechanism. When people aren't using something, when it's not working, those local advocates are going to be a great source of insight into why. So I think all of that's important.
They are. And Lauren, Michelle Fredericks, I want to call you out because I agree with you. I think building those coalitions of excited people who want to be inspired, who want to be part of the thing, is a great way to keep the momentum going and help you keep your sanity along the way. The other thing I want to add, Lauren, and I know you've got a poll coming after this, guys, just go back to the fundamental reason of why we always said you need advocates on the ground to help with knowledge flow, because they're closer, they have a relationship with the teams or the groups, they understand knowledge needs, they understand the barriers. So couple all that together and just put it under the lens of change. They can do the same things. They're going to know what barriers need to be taken down better than you will. And so they're just your megaphone on the ground.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I do have a poll around this. I really wanted to understand, what tasks do KM roles in your business take on within the organization? And I think this is a single choice. So I would say, why don't you just put the one that you feel like is the most important or provides the most value to you? And obviously, if you don't have KM roles in the business, you can select that. Is it really around figuring out what experts you need to capture knowledge from, or where you need to start a new community, or what projects have critical content that you need to harvest? Is it that communication where they stand up in their local team meeting and share, hey, here's what's going on with KM, and remember KM, all those kinds of things? Is it around the training and coaching, or is it the feedback? So I'd love to hear just kind of what y'all think is the most important piece that you can get from these folks if you have them. And we'll give you a minute or two.
Well, we had a great question. Would a community of practice for KM be part of the communication strategy? And I wrote in there, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Again, those are your advocates. They're already committed because they like to get together and talk. Got something.
And that can help you find advocates. And also, depending on your strategy, you may find some folks interested in KM in different parts of the organization, different functions, different locations. Oh, wow. So really big focus on identifying critical knowledge or opportunities. I think that's really interesting. I think that is a big focus, is solving the right problem, right? And if you're not solving the right problem with KM, then everything you do on the back end around managing change is probably not going to be very effective. So figuring out what you need to do for the business, what's going to resonate, then I think a lot of these other pieces fall into place. So we are moving from communications to this reinforcement piece that you all said was a gap and really important for you. We've planned and communicated the change. Then what's the next step? And really, the KM advocates can be helpful in terms of reinforcing. So they're a superpower. You can put in that communicate and reinforce category. But in terms of reinforcing the change, I think KM usually does a pretty good job of ongoing communication and formal rewards and recognition. But I think that where we sometimes fall down is going further to really embed KM into the business. And first, I think that that's embedding knowledge capture, sharing, reuse into how people work. So maybe your project management methodology needs explicit steps to say, here's where you go look at the lessons learned database. And here is at the end of a project milestone where you need to capture those things and put them back into the system. Maybe if a manager has a meeting or an event, at the end, they have a process step to say, hey, did we create anything or decide anything here that needs to be captured in any of these knowledge repositories and systems? If you have people working directly in applications, like a customer service person, a claims adjuster, whoever they are, do knowledge resources need to be built into their digital workflow so that they can seamlessly access them, so that they're recommended to them based on what they're doing, or maybe that knowledge is built directly into guiding that digital workflow. And then the other piece that I think is important here is to have KM built into people's jobs. So sometimes that's roles and job descriptions, especially for folks like, subject matter experts or people who are going to take on a community leader role. But more broadly, it's incorporating desired KM behaviors into performance management and making effective sharing and reuse criteria for promotions in key areas. So it's not enough to know stuff and to do your job well, but you're really being measured and promoted based on how well you mentor other folks and bring other people up to your level. And sometimes this gets formally incorporated into performance measures, which is great, but it can also be more informal and implicit. If managers start asking the right questions in conversations with their reports and people start to see that knowledge sharing or taking a knowledge leadership role of some kind is, something that can give you a career jumpstart, then that makes a big difference in the cultural attitudes towards KM. People are very good at picking up those signals, regardless of whether it's on their official list of goals. So I think that's all really helpful.
Hey, Lauren, this is because this is such a big passion of mine. One of the things that I think we fail to do is when we talk about building knowledge management into the process. Yes, of course, how do your communities work? How do the lessons learned fit in? But you guys make sure you go back to the knowledge flow process. And we have that so heavily documented in the resource library. Lauren has just gone above and beyond on that. And it's because, and I'll go on record with this entire group, if I could change anything in my 25 years of knowledge management, I would wind the clock back and I would focus more on those steps than doing the approaches first, because then they'll make everything else make sense. And that's how you get closer to embedding, because we're knowledge workers, right, Lauren? And so everything we do, we're finding that out in content management. We're already doing those steps of the process for the knowledge management workflow. It just doesn't always work that well. So just make sure you think about that when you talk about Build KM. Go back to the fundamentals of ours is a 7-step process, yours may be 4 or 3, but do that.
I also think knowledge mapping can be really helpful here if you want to lay out where knowledge goes in and out and through your business processes, and that can really help you find some of those opportunities to embed knowledge sharing, access, reuse into those business processes. Sometimes the classics are classic for a reason.
They work.
So I put this example. We have so many good examples of putting KM in the flow of work. This one is from ARIP, which is one of our level 5 maturity excellence in KM recipients from a year or two ago. And I put their vision for knowledge up here because I like its focus on using the collective intelligence of the organization to deliver value to clients. So it's a vision for how knowledge enables the business. And I think a lot of what they do flows down from that big picture view. This is something that's communicated to employees, and it underpins why people get involved in KM. And they have great access to knowledge content, seamless content across projects that can help, with reuse across projects, improve those project cycle times and costs and things like that. They also have really robust tools for people-to-people connections through networks and discussion forums and connecting people to lessons learned. And all of that's just built into how they work. So if you encounter a problem in a project, you're going to go to the right skills network or the right discussion forum and engage people out, in other parts of the organization who may have encountered something similar. They also do a really good job of building this into their employee lifecycle, from onboarding. This is how we work. This is how you operate here. This is how you get ahead. Here's your KM handbook, through, the learning paths that people take and incorporating KM into that, recognizing that, KM is part of how you build your reputation and your career up to that senior expert fellows level within the organization, and having that be key criterion. So there's lots of different examples. We have a great white paper on this that's linked at the end of the session as well. So many different ways to do this depending on your culture, but I think that the work processes and the roles and expectations always both need to be, dealt with. And the other thing that I think people forget when reinforcing KM is that you need to make it fun. Make the tools engaging, use humor, friendly competition, make funny memes to advertise KM, build a scavenger hunt through your KM system, give out coffee mugs and keychains, whatever works. Back in 2010, Cindy, you and I were both involved in a KM advanced working group that looked at making KM fun. And I remember the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland had built a skit that was based on the dating game, where they had people come up with knowledge needs and their contestants were the wiki, the intranet, and the community practice, something like that. And you had to match those knowledge needs to the right contestant. And it was a riot, and it was funny. And because of that, people learned what the wiki was, that, they took away from that. And I think that that's really important, and it's stuck with me. Last year we did an interview with Teach for America, and they were involved in a big migration change from Google Sites to a new intranet site. And you can see the advertisement here. They had an official retirement party for their Google site where people could come watch those sites get deleted live and have a trivia contest. So I think that there's a lot of creative ways that you can engage people in this kind of change. And sometimes, at least when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, it's having those big splashy events. And I've got, a photograph of one of those over here. But, I think there's a lot that you can do with a very small budget, no budget, virtually, just by being creative. And, and it makes KM a cool club that people want to join. And that is not to be underrated.
Lauren, so I have to give her, I'm going to give her away. So when we get into projects at APQC, or she's getting ready to start some research and she'll invite me to something for input and stuff, I'll go, isn't this going to be fun? She is so taught for years, dozens of years. She has heard me say that. But I did put in the chat, and thank you, Badu. Fun is not frivolous, right? Fun is meaningful, engaging, pointed. It takes a heck of a lot of facilitation, guys. That means you have to think about what will inspire them and then test that to get them to participate in all of these things. And yes, I love the big productions of rewards and recognition, and that does reinforce, but senior leadership's just giving a recognition in a chat feature is sometimes pretty powerful. So you got to balance this stuff out, and it can't take all of your time. That's why you need your advocates reporting into you.
Absolutely. I'm always excited to talk about fun.
But this is fun, right? We're having fun.
Cindy and I always have fun
I
together.
would rather be doing this than anything else. So there you are, guys. I'm with you all. I like the Cool Club too, Catherine.
And I just have a few more examples here. These are from Infosys. I just love the way they advertise some of their learning approaches. You know, what's on your learning playlist, the technology playground, you know, we met a learning goal, you know, there's some humor in it, and it makes it feel like something that you want to be a part of and that you want to do. And it connects back to, you know, activities that maybe you do in your personal life. And I just think that it's really smart way to approach KM communications. So we've been talking about this iterative cycle all the time, but we're going to kind of zero in on it here. Because I think that the biggest mistake we see KM teams make around change management is to think that they're done. When we treat KM change management as a project and we're ticking off all of the boxes, you know, we want to get done and move on. And that's a natural human reaction to having to do anything. But the reality is a lot messier. With KM, the user needs are always changing. New obstacles pop up, new opportunities. The tools and approaches are changing all the time, especially if you're using cloud-based software. You know, you often don't have any control over that aspect of change. So you need to continually monitor what is and isn't working and continue to reassess and revise the change approach over time. You know, and I think there's a variety of metrics, whether it's activity measures, process measures, impact measures, you know, and also some of that qualitative feedback, whether you're asking people for it or they're bringing it to you in various formats.
Yeah. Lauren, you're going to give some really good examples, guys. I have to put my 2 cents in. I promise I'll try to make this very long story short. But in our experience, and I've seen it work firsthand, measurement and having a really good measurement approach or strategy, whatever you want to call it, for knowledge management is one of your most powerful change management tools. And the reason I say that, think what happens when you start measuring things, even just activity that we're talking about. People start getting really attentive and sometimes a little bit upset that you're reporting out things, especially if you just take it for an example, community participation, and one community is outperforming another. Now, there's always the quality of participation, and I get all of that. But I'm encouraging you, it seems like we have a very wide spectrum of those of you who are kind of in the early stages on your journey of KM and those who've been there, done that, and watching it all. But you've always got to get people interested, and measures help you start doing that, especially when you can engage your audience. And there's a lot of tools that we have to get them engaged. They, you know, just diving in and creating measures is not always the way to do that. But to start talking about what people would like to see. And if we do these activities, if you participate in a community of practice, or if you participate in a lessons learned process, and we learn these things and we begin to get them transferred, what does that mean for the business? And you start creating your stories. And I would think most of you would agree with me, storytelling has been a really powerful measurement tool because it links cause and effect. It gives you the story between what you're trying to do as an impact. And so I can't impress on you enough, think of measurement as a change activity and use it as such, but you've got to have all the things that Lauren has talked about. You've got to have commitments, you've got to have reinforcement, you have to have good communications. It's got to be just part of the DNA as you move forward. And so, yeah, Andrea, thank you. Measuring impact is essential, and you do have to get there eventually. And the best thing I can tell you all is just ask what they expect to see. Because if they expect to see something that you're not even measuring right now, you're not going to be able to show that right away. And you need to be able to say that. Great, we can create a baseline. We can do this. Here's your timeline for making this happen, Mr. Senior Leader, Miss Senior Leader. Is that what you want to see? So I just want to make sure that you guys look at this as an opportunity. I was thrilled when Lauren put this in, and it's an iterative approach, right, Lauren? Like, you just can't get to impact measures other than some stories if you're just getting started. But you sure as heck can start measuring activities and how your approaches are working.
Yeah, it really focuses you on what you're trying to achieve and is a really good way to communicate it. We've got a couple of comments on the storytelling being key. And I think when you can put some of the success stories and anecdotes together with some data and package that as a story in a compelling way, that is so powerful when you're trying to communicate up, down, around. That's crucial.
Yeah.
So I included this example from Mercer because I think they do a great job of continually monitoring KM activity, whether that's in their communities of practice, and that's the example that I happen to have here, or in their content systems. They have a great data and insights group as part of their KM effort. And I think it's easy when you're measuring, especially activities, to focus on top level numbers, like this percentage is using the KM system. But I think things tend to get more interesting when you look at what people are doing with KM and the demographic factors that affect usage. So that tells you what audiences you're serving successfully and where you're either not serving the audience or you have a communication gap. And you can draw meaningful insights and make recommendations to help further embed it and get you to the next level. So this continuous cycle is all about gap analysis. Where are we going gangbusters? How can we capitalize on that? Where do we have gaps, and how can we target those problem areas? And then, we've been talking about this cycle that includes, I think, endless micro adjustments. But I also just want to say that there are moments where I think you've got to take a step back, look at the big picture, and make sure that you are investing your time and budget and energy in the right things. And this is a photograph from a presentation that the folks at Technique FMC gave at one of our KM conferences a couple of years ago about a reinvention workshop that their whole KM team held. And they needed to streamline what they were doing. So they really went through their KM portfolio, looked at each of the services that they offered, and looked at, what are the benefits of the service? What are any issues? And what are ideas, whether that's improving it or consolidating it or whatever it is. I think we see a lot of people get really in love with the things that they're doing, especially if they've created success in the past, and putting on that, design thinking hat and saying, is this still working for us in our current environment, is sometimes really painful, but really powerful. We have a good KM practitioner friend of the center who always says, don't fall in love with your program. Something may have worked great before. It doesn't mean it's the right approach going forward. And you have to keep an open mind and make hard choices. And if you're willing to do that, I think it helps build trust with your audience over time and really drives towards that sustained change. So our final section here really focuses on what I see as the pinnacle of the change journey, which is getting the business not just to buy in, but to become advocates for KM and to take on some accountability. I think in almost all cases, you're going to need some kind of centralized resource, and it doesn't have to be enterprise-wide. It could be centralized to R&D or whatever your scope is. But you need somebody to manage the tools and the approaches and provide support. But you also want to engage leadership and push some of the decision making to them if you can, whether that's in the form of an executive sponsor, a steering committee, a cross-functional leadership team that provides some kind of KM oversight. And then finally, the business really has to play a role here, especially as you mature. Over time, business stakeholders hopefully see the benefits of KM, and they need to take some responsibility for managing their own knowledge within the tools and approaches that KM provides and enables. So you need that partnership between KM and the business if you want sustainable change. And I think that we have a poll in here, our final poll here, and I think about a third of you said that this was your biggest gap around business ownership. So I wanted to get a sense of what extent do business stakeholders in your organization or part of the organization assume ownership for their role in KM? And we've definitely seen this. This is a big part of the change journey, even for mature organizations, getting the business to have skin in the game and to devote time and energy to doing this. Whether it's assigning content owners to, attest to review, update content on a regular basis, to spend time, leading communities, stewarding bodies of knowledge. I think that's all part and parcel, and if you can't get the business to do that, then you may need to go back to the drawing board and figure out how you can better support them so that they see that need for investment. So a lot of people in the a little or somewhat category, a couple people in a lot, and nobody in fully. Any surprises there, Cindy?
Lauren, I don't think so. This group has surprised me some, but yeah. Maybe this is a good time, Lauren. I know we've got another slide. You've got a great example, but one of the early questions we had was, how long should change management stay in place? Like, what does this look like? And I want to, how long should, here, I'll read it exactly. How long should change management engage with stakeholders after the change has taken place? Does it stop, and then are there steps to follow? First of all, Drew, this was yours. I don't think anybody should stop. Don't ever consider change stopping. And I think that was, I posted earlier, there's the paradox of sustaining change and evolving. And evolving always gives you that promise of a little more excitement, newness, where it's why the technology we always want, because it's new and exciting and it promises all of this until it doesn't. And so I think that is where you have to, Bob Buckman said it so well. 25 years ago, he is the chairman and CEO of Buckman Laboratories and one of our early pioneers. And he said, knowledge management is 90% culture, culture, culture. That's what it's all about. And so if I just take his words forward, it is about constant change. And I always tell people, when you get into this, it's ongoing. The conversations, your job, if you're doing it right, will be to constantly encourage, influence, promote, get people onboarded to be part of this journey, and it just never stops. And so I hope that it doesn't seem too daunting. You take it in bite-sized pieces and deal with what you have to, and that's what Lauren's been showing you at the time and point where you are. But it just never stops. It needs to be part of your goals.
And listening to you, Cindy, I think managing expectations for the business is a big part of managing this kind of change, because especially if they listen to software vendors and other people, they can think that it's easy and they're going to get a lot of results quickly sometimes. And I think setting some milestones and some manageable goals, incremental goals, can be really powerful here as a change management approach, as part of using measurement as a change management approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is my final slide. I wanted to end with an example from Prudential Financial, and this is one of our 2021 Excellence in KM recipients. And they're a very mature and successful KM program that they've built over, just a few years, really. And their approach to change management over the first 2 years, I think, has been really instrumental in their success. It encompasses many of the steps we've talked about today. They started with that design thinking hat on, analyzing key stakeholders, identifying change impacts, and really looking at executives, managers, different end user groups. And then they developed a really tailored change strategy for each of those stakeholder groups. So it wasn't cookie cutter. And a big part of that was customized demos for each end user group to show them, this is what you're going to get, and this is how we can help you. And as part of the rollout, they really looked at data to understand what was and wasn't working, and continuously reassess and tweak the approach. And then in the second year, they developed a new change strategy based on how they wanted to move forward and the data that they had and all the feedback that they'd received. They engaged leaders, they built an advisory board that surfaces new KM needs, that makes decisions about KM and provides feedback on rollouts. So that's helped with that iterative loop and also building that business ownership. And since 2019, they've continued to use metrics and feedback to improve KM, to build KM roles out in the business and strengthen that distributed ownership model between KM and the business. So I think they're a really good example to look at. So we maybe have time for one question. Cindy, is there anything that's jumping out at you here? I know we've been kind of trying to take them as we go along.
We have, and there's been a lot of really good ones. I've responded to a lot, Lauren. I think I just responded to one who was asking about they're going to stakeholders. It's about getting started and getting the buy-in to get started. And I think there's so many people on this call that can tell you how to get started. But one of the things that they are encountering is the business is saying, we know how to do this, we can just do this. And my advice was saying, meet them where they are. Don't try to say, oh, we have all these great approaches and tools. Always start with the asset you're trying to move through a full cycle from identifying it to understanding it to transferring it to making it useful again and reuse. And so if you start in where they are and say, how can we help you make this better? And you go with one of a servitude attitude, I'm going to help you and make it better. Chances are you will, because you have the smarts of KM. And then you just keep expanding that and doing that approach over and over again. That's the short, very, concise answer. But I bet our group has a lot.
Well, and this is such a great topic. Maybe we need to do a roundtable and bring people together for an interactive discussion around this. So we'll look at that and carrying on this conversation because I think it's a really good one.
Absolutely.
And for those of you who are maybe newer to the KM change management piece or want a refresher, I have a bunch of resources in here for you around how you build change management capabilities across the different levels of KM maturity, and then digging into those different aspects of change management, communications, training, how you build KM into the flow of work, breaking the barriers to knowledge sharing. Cindy and I have been through the top 10 barriers to knowledge sharing and how you address each of those, rewards and recognition. And then we've ended with a couple of really practitioner-led pieces around advice from KMers who've been around the block with this, around adoption and behavior change and people and culture tips. So I really encourage everybody to check out the resources, reach out to us if you have more questions, and we'll look at ways to carry on the conversation around KM and change.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye, everyone. I hope to see you next month.
Yes.